In the 90s, the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC dominated the music charts, sold millions of records, and performed in front of thousands of screaming fans. For these young men plucked from obscurity, it seemed too good to be true, and that's because it was. Beneath the veneer of their teenage pop music was a scam, and both boy bands were just some of the thousands of people their manager, Lou Pearlman, had manipulated and deceived. Lou Pearlman was born into a fairly ordinary American family, but was an excellent salesman and businessman. In 1975, when Pearlman was still in his early 20s, he started his own company, Transcontinental, which was a helicopter rental company. And in the early 80s, he was involved in the blimp business. Pearlman had convinced the brothers behind Jordache Jeans to sponsor his blimp, which was expected to fly across Manhattan and bring them tons of publicity. The blimp set off from Lakehurst, New Jersey airport, but as it took off, the blimp went into a spiral and crashed into some nearby garbage dump. Thankfully, the two people on board were not injured. Despite this sequence of catastrophic events, Pearlman had a stroke of luck. The crash resulted in a legal battle with the insurer, and Pearlman was awarded $2.5 million in damages. This was the first of many times Pearlman would be engaged in bitter battles in the courtroom. Pearlman used this cash to fund his own airplane charter service, Planet Airways, where his planes were hired by business people, wealthy individuals, and sometimes even celebrities. One of his planes was rented by New Kids on the Block, a boy band that excelled in the late 80s. Pearlman was stunned and wondered how these young men could afford to rent a plane that cost $250,000 a month. He realized just how much money these boy bands were making and wanted a piece of the action. Speaking in an interview in 2000, Pearlman said, "I don't know who they were, and I was just questioning. How could these kids afford an airplane? I was told these kids did $200 million in record sales and $800 million in touring and merchandising. I was like, I'm in the wrong business." So in 1991, Pearlman moved to Orlando, Florida, where many young people had flocked to in order to secure jobs at its theme parks. Pearlman held auditions for a new boy band and saw potential in three guys named Nick Carter, AJ McLean, and Howie Doro. In a performance of Aladdin, he also spotted Kevin Richardson, who also recommended his cousin Brian Luttrell. These five men would become, as you may have guessed it, the Backstreet Boys. Pearlman saw them as boy band material and financed whatever steps were needed to make them the next New Kids on the Block. Pearlman said, "I put the money out to help them. We'd give them choreographers, we'd give them vocal lessons, we'd give them tutors. I think I'm a great cultivator." Also, if you're also very interested in music stories, you should subscribe to this channel. In total, Pearlman pumped $3 million into the group's development. However, their first single was a flop and was out of step with the alternative rock scene that was doing well at the time. The only saving grace was that the Backstreet Boys were doing incredibly well in Europe and Canada, so the band spent the next 2 years aggressively touring, sometimes for 5 months straight. It wasn't until the success of the Spice Girls and Hanson in the US that the Backstreet Boys also made waves in their home country. By 1997, Pearlman's plan had worked to a T. The Backstreet Boys single "Quit Playing Games with My Heart" sold 2 million copies in the US and became the most successful single on the Billboard Hot 100 chart that year. And they were getting so successful, they were now shaping American culture. Barry Weiss, the president of Jive Records, said, "They were probably single-handedly responsible for the advent of Total Request Live, for Radio Disney, for teen people becoming the force it has become, and no doubt for the explosion in teen purchasing power in America. They pushed the envelope." Pearlman by then had already planned on diversifying his investments. In 1995, Chris Kirkpatrick was looking to start his own boy band and recruited Joey Fatone and Lance Bass. He also managed to recruit J.C. Chase and Justin Timberlake, both of whom had already starred in the Disney show The Mickey Mouse Club. When using the last letters of all their first names, they called themselves NSYNC. And just like the Backstreet Boys, Pearlman agreed to finance them and mold them into another hit boy band. They released their self-titled album NSYNC in '97, the same year that the Backstreet Boys had properly blown up. But while the Backstreet Boys were signed to Jive Records, Pearlman decided that NSYNC could be signed to his own new record company, Transcontinental Records. At this time, Pearlman owned a corporation called Transcontinental, which included an airline, a film and music studio, talent and travel agencies, restaurants, and real estate. As manager of these two successful bands, Pearlman would also court investors for these other businesses. These potential investors were offered limo rides, flights on private planes, and were even introduced to members of NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys. Pearlman also launched an investment scheme for investors he called an employee investment savings account, which would offer substantial returns every year. Former Backstreet Boys manager Johnny Wright told 2020, he would send a private jet to pick you up. Then when you landed in Orlando, he would send his private limo to get you. You drove to his office, which was quite impressive. Then when you walked through the door, he's on the phone with Barry Gordy or whoever. Oh yeah, we'll close that deal, don't worry about it. 1998 was when the cracks started to emerge. Both boy bands had incredibly hectic touring and recording schedules, and Perlman covered all of their expenses and gave each member a per diem to spend on whatever they wanted every day. I don't know how much Backstreet Boys got, but NSYNC got $35 per day to spend and were promised that they would share the earnings of all album sales and tours at a later day. Lou was like a father figure to them, to the extent that he was nicknamed Big Papa, so they trusted him. They were incredibly grateful to him for making their dreams come true, until they looked into the actual figures. In the spring of 1998, the Backstreet Boys discovered that Perlman had been hiding money from them. When confronted by this, Perlman's defense was that he had paid $3 million to get them off the ground, and was now being rewarded for what was a risky investment. But the numbers were, on the whole, exploitative to say the least. The group made $10 million in recording and touring revenue since '93, and the Backstreet Boys were given $300,000 between them. This meant that each member of the Backstreet Boys, which by then was the biggest boy band in the world, was making $12,000 a year per member. So the Backstreet Boys filed a lawsuit against them, and eventually they reached a settlement and allowed them to break free from Perlman's management. On this contract was what became known as the six-member clause. Perlman had written himself down as the sixth member of the Backstreet Boys and was fully entitled to their earnings. So despite parting ways, Perlman was still entitled to 17% of their earnings. In 1999, NSYNC also had their world crash down for them too. All 5 members and their families were invited to Laurie's The Prime Rib in Beverly Hills to celebrate their success. Perlman had treated them to a fancy restaurant and again portrayed himself as a generous father figure. After 3 years of playing in front of sold-out crowds and selling millions of records, the members of NSYNC were finally about to receive the money they had generated from the band. When each member opened up their envelopes, they couldn't believe their eyes. Each member had received a check of $10,000. While the Backstreet Boys were paid $12,000 a year, the members of NSYNC were only getting $3,300 a year. The second biggest boy band on the planet was not even making anywhere near minimum wage. NSYNC compared it to indentured servitude. Lance Bass of NSYNC said, "This is when I knew we were being taken advantage of. There was something wrong. We immediately started calling lawyers." So, just like the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC sued Perlman. But just like the Backstreet Boys, Perlman had also placed himself as the sixth member of NSYNC. In 2000, another bitter court battle took place, but NSYNC broke free of Perlman and released a new album. And as a sneak diss to their former manager, it was called No Strings Attached. In the music video for their hit single Bye Bye Bye, all 5 members are all puppets connected to strings, and was the band mocking the Pinocchio-like lives they led under Perlman. Perlman tried to replicate this formula with other boy bands and artists. He had some successes with O-Town, LFO, and Nick Carter's brother Aaron Carter. However, he couldn't replicate the success he had with the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, and the tides of musical tastes were changing. When NSYNC broke free of Lou Perlman, there were still many unanswered questions. Despite being signed to Transcontinental Records, they never once used Transcontinental Airlines for their tours, and always traveled via Delta. And everything about Lou Perlman was starting to unravel. As it turned out, the FBI was looking into Perlman, and before they could arrest him, Perlman had fled the country. The reason why NSYNC had never traveled on Transcontinental Airlines is because it had no airplanes, and the company itself only existed inside Lou Perlman's head. Many of his transcontinental companies were simply fictitious, and he took money from investors as part of a Ponzi scheme. On the brochure of Transcontinental Airlines, Perlman had taken a photo of a toy plane. The scheme was simple. Investors would receive dividends, or extra money, early on and were given the impression that this was a great pension plan. In reality, the dividends were payments from newer victims, and he had done it over and over and managed to screw roughly 2,000 people, mostly Florida retirees. And this scam was running long before the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. To keep the scam going, Perlman regularly took loans out from banks, and these banks paid money to Perlman's accounting firm, which also didn't exist. Roger Handberg, a federal prosecutor in Central Florida, explained, he would use the money to plug whatever hole that he needed to plug. So if he had bank fraud money that he needed to use to pay off an investor, he would do that. If he had a problem where he had to pay a bank some money, he would use the investor money. All the money was commingled, and it was used however it would benefit him. His financial frauds were first discovered when Joseph Chow, one of Perlman's biggest investors, died of pancreatic cancer. His relatives were now in charge of his finances, and they realized how much money was going to Perlman. Perlman and his manipulation of their father made them and the authorities wonder just how deep the rabbit hole went. Around the same time, rumors circulated that he was involved in things much worse than white-collar crime. An expose about Perlman appeared in Vanity Fair and was titled "Mad About the Boys." The article alleged that Perlman's interest in the boy band industry went far beyond money. In the article in Vanity Fair, it read, "Some, especially the teenagers, shrugged and giggled when he showed them X-rated movies or jumped naked on their beds in the morning to wrestle and play. Others, it appears, didn't get off so easily. For any number of young men who sought to join the world's greatest boy bands, Big Papa's attentions were an open secret, the price some paid for fame." While these allegations were difficult to prove, his financial crimes were a lot more clear-cut. He had scammed these people and needed to pay the price. But the question on everyone's mind was, where was he and where was all the money? The Vanity Fair article stated, "Most of those milling about Perlman's offices had scant idea what he had done wrong, much less where he had fled to. Some said Israel, or Germany, or Ireland, or Belarus. After months of fleeing the scene, it was finally revealed where Perlman had gone. A German tourist spotted him on the island of Bali in Indonesia, and it's believed that he contacted the authorities. Conveniently, the FBI had an attaché in Jakarta, in Indonesia, and Perlman was arrested. The gig was finally up. In 2008, Perlman stood before an Orlando court. He admitted to defrauding multiple banks and investors and is believed to have frauded $300 million in total. He took a plea deal, in which the prosecution hoped would help bring back some of the money taken from the victims. A startling statistic is that towards the end, Perlman was sued by every single artist he represented, except for the boy band US5. Behind bars, Perlman started a choir and also wanted to set up a reality TV show. And in 2014, he said, "You know, I deeply regret what happened, and I'll be back." But Perlman never set foot again as a free man. In 2016, he suffered a cardiac arrest and died in prison. And strangely enough, his death resulted in mixed feelings from the people who knew him. He had screwed them over, but he was also the reason behind their success. Perlman's biggest star, Justin Timberlake, tweeted, "I hope he found some peace. God bless and RIP, Lou Pearlman." Lance Bass reluctantly said, "When I heard that Lou Pearlman had passed away, I was so confused on exactly how to feel. I was like, how could you die right now when we don't have this closure? You need to apologize. Like, there are so many people who are waiting for you to realize what you did." However, Lance also said, "There's also so many life lessons that you learn from everyone else's mistakes, from your mistakes. Perlman helped start my career. He funded it. I don't know where I'd be without him. So you have to give him that credit." And Aaron Carter also had the same sense of mixed feelings. He wrote, "Lou Pearlman, my old manager, died in prison. RIP Lou. Not the best business guy really at all, but he did discover me. Karma is real." Make sure to subscribe for more.